My name is Joe Brassell from just outside of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Bensalem, Bucks County, and went to the Mayo Clinic in May 10th of 2004, not knowing what was the problem. Back in the city in Philly, they weren't sure what was going on. They had an option, they had a reason to think it may be an amyloid, but they weren't sure. They were going to send me on a course of primary amyloidosis, which turned out to be incorrect. So when I heard that, they weren't giving me all the answers that I needed, so we decided to get a second opinion. And we went on the internet and we looked up and we saw that the Mayo Clinic did more amyloid cases than anyone. So we contacted them and asked them if we could come out for an appointment. And we got that appointment about a week and a half later. And we got out, and when we got to Mayo, it took about 3 days for them to realize that it was not primary amyloid, it was familial amyloid. So they proceeded to tell me that I needed a heart and a liver transplant at that time. So I started to do, took about 2.5 weeks to 3 weeks to check me to see if I could become a candidate for the transplant. And at the end of that time, which was about the 30th of May, we met with the docs, and the doctor, the director, basically said, I'm not going to pull any punches. You have about 2 months to live. What would you like us to do? So I looked at the wife and I said, I looked back at the doc. I said, I don't want to die. And he goes, good, that's what I want to hear. And he turned to his nurse and he said, we're going to start this and do this and do this. And he came back to me, he said, I want you to go home, take 2 weeks, be back here in 2 weeks' time, get your affairs in order, and we're going to try to put your case together and we'll see if we get you on the organ list. And June 14th, I was back at the Mayo Clinic, brought a guitar back with me, which I never played before in my life. And during the next weeks waiting in the hospital, I practiced my guitar 4 or 6 hours a day to spend the time. And in my 7th week of that prediction is when I got my donor. I started getting weak and my heart was getting harder and less flexible. And it turned out that it was a success. And the way it came about was it was wonderful the way it was. It was a Sunday afternoon. It was actually Sunday morning, 9 o'clock. The nurse that was taking care of me, Anna, came in and said, Joe, I want you to call your wife, but right now I need to tell you something. And she pulled a chair up and grabbed my hand and said, we have a 60% chance of a donor today. And you know, your heart just goes through you just get crazy. You just don't realize, you know, all of a sudden you waited for this moment and now here it is. You're happy, and it seems like seconds later you realize that someone has lost their life and to give you a life. And then the sadness comes in, and then you go over it, and you go back to the joy, and you go back to the sadness, and you flip-flop. And finally my wife came over, and then, you know, we were just sitting there for the next couple hours, and every hour almost they would come in and say, okay, now we're at 70%. Things are starting to prepare, you know, everything's looking good. And it went on that way, and then they took me down and they got me, you know, ready, bathed and all that. Came back to the room again, and then one nurse came back and said, she was a PA. She said that, my name is Susan, and she said, you're at 80% chance right now of going. And with my record, is if you see me again, it's 95% go. And out of that time, most of it is a success with her. And about an hour later, about somewhere around 2 o'clock, she just appeared at the door, looked, didn't say a word. Wife and I started crying, and we knew we were ready to go. My transplant coordinator, Kevin, came in right after that and said, Joe, we're securing an OR room for you. It should be ready about 3:30, so we'll be back about 3. He came back at 3 and rolled me down to the operating room. Anna took my wife with her, and the 4 of us went down to the OR and hit the front door And that's when he said, you know, Joe, you gotta say, you know, see you to your wife now. And it was the strangest feeling. With the weeks that I had in the Mayo Clinic, with the treatment that I got, with the staff, the way they were, it was just a fantastic feeling. And I had no worries. When I hit that double door, I didn't have any fear. I just felt deep down inside, I'm coming back. I'm going to be through this. It's not going to be a problem. Gave my wife a big hug and a kiss and said, you know, I'll see you in a little bit. And away I went. And when I went in the door of the operating room, I started walking in and there was a lot of clatter and noise, and it was cold and I could feel it. And I got a little nervous then, but then as soon as I did, they must have felt that, because the nurses were up to me and introducing me individually. I'm Colleen, I'm with the heart staff, and I'm so-and-so, and I'm with the liver group. And next thing, the anesthesiologist came in and said that, you know, I'm just going to give you something mild just to relax you a little bit. And that's the last thing I remember. And it was a 12.5-hour operation. I remember my wife telling me later that Dr. Durrani, Dr. Rosen, and the rest of the staff were in every 20 minutes, half hour. There was something going on, and doctors were showing up when they had breaks. Kept my family informed. And then about, I guess it was something around, I guess it was like 3:30 it started, and it was like 2:30 in the morning or somewhere in that area. It was wrapping up, and I think they woke me at 12 o'clock the following day. And I can remember waking up for a moment, looking at the window, and seeing my wife and my daughter and my son. And the only thing I could move was my hand. I just gave my hand and gave them the thumbs up, and then they put me back to sleep again, and then they woke me up later. And next day they had me up walking 20 feet, which I thought was going to be impossible to do, but I did it. And then I left the hospital in about 2 weeks and stayed at the Gift of Life Transplant House in Rochester. And we were there for 90 days, and it was another great experience. And I go back every year now to Mayo. I'm heading back after these games for my 6th annual checkup. And I love the Mayo Clinic. I think it's the greatest clinic on earth. And I want to thank the whole staff of the Mayo Clinic for what they've given me. Something I can never express in words. So thank you, Mayo. I appreciate it. Organ donation, I belong to an AOH meeting, a group which is an ancient order of Hibernians of Irish people. And I try to talk to them constantly about the organ donation. And I know that just by speaking to those people, I've turned probably 50 or 60 people to go into signing up. And I talk to people many times that they're afraid that, you know, well, maybe they're not going to help me when I get to that point if they see donor on the thing. And I try to explain to them, it doesn't make any sense for the doc to let you go to save me when they can save you. Stop the second step. I mean, they're not going to do that, you know. And I had a friend of mine that was in the AOH that was not a donor, put the donor on his license, and about a year later, unfortunately, was killed in a motorcycle accident. Wound up donating all his major organs and saved so many people. So I just talk it up whenever I can. I think it's the greatest thing going. I know there's people that have hang-ups on it, but when you can see, and I encourage them to try to come to these transplant games to see, I guess the biggest thing that caught me when I went to Pittsburgh was my first games. And I went into Pittsburgh, and the recipients all came in, and we all sat down after it came in by the cities and such. And the donor families started to come in. And the first group of donor families started to come in, and it was a woman, probably in her mid-40s, coming in all smiles and giggles and everything. And all of a sudden, she looked down, and she saw the group. She saw 6,500 recipients and their families behind them. And she realized what her loved one had done. And the expression on her face will live with me forever. It was just that, like, oh my God, I've done this. My loved one has done this. And there wasn't a dry eye in the recipient group because we all kind of just locked in at that point. It was a period of, and if people could only see that, they would understand how important it is to donate. So I just hope that people continue.